In the Soviet Union alone, someone died from World War II every 4 seconds for 4 straight years. That calculation comes from the Soviet Academy of Sciences' figure of 26.6 million Soviet deaths over the war's duration. But the Soviet Union was just one theater in a global catastrophe that consumed lives at an unprecedented rate across every continent. For 80 years, we accepted that World War II killed approximately 70 million people. But new research in 2025 reveals those traditional casualty figures were systematically undercounted. The World Population Review now places the upper range at 85 million deaths, while some modern scholars push the total near 100 million. The actual numbers will change how you see this war forever. The question is how we finally arrived at these revised figures after 8 decades of incomplete data. The AI revolution in historical research. Traditional historical methods simply couldn't handle the scale of documentation that World War II produced. Archives across the globe held millions of uncatalogued files that had never been properly processed or analyzed. The Russian State Military Archive alone contained over 23 million unprocessed documents. Chinese provincial archives held more than 31 million wartime records that remained largely unanalyzed. These weren't just administrative records or supply lists. They included casualty reports, medical records, prisoner logs, and death certificates written in dozens of languages, many damaged by fire, water, or simple decay after 8 decades in storage. Historians estimated it would take centuries to work manually through tens of millions of documents scattered across international archives. The breakthrough came in 2023 when major archives in Germany, Russia, China, and other nations collaborated with technology partners to launch an unprecedented documentation project. Teams combined historical expertise with cutting-edge artificial intelligence systems specifically designed for historical analysis. Their goal was ambitious beyond anything attempted in historical research. They wanted to process every surviving World War II document using machine learning algorithms that could overcome the barriers that had made systematic analysis impossible with conventional methods. The scale of untouched documentation was staggering. The German Federal Archive had 18 million documents that had received only cursory examination. Japanese military archives held 14 million documents, many written in archaic military terminology that few modern scholars could read fluently. Polish, Czech, and Romanian archives contributed millions more. Even American and British archives, considered well-organized by historical standards, reveal massive gaps where documents had been filed but never properly analyzed for casualty data. The machine learning algorithms developed for this project represented a quantum leap in document processing capability. Traditional optical character recognition systems failed when confronted with water-damaged pages, faded ink, or handwritten text in Cyrillic, Chinese characters, or Gothic German script. The new AI systems used neural networks trained on millions of historical documents to recognize text patterns even when pages were partially destroyed. They could identify names, dates, and casualty figures in documents where human readers saw only smudges and fragments. More sophisticated was the contextual analysis component. The AI didn't just read individual documents. It cross-referenced information across thousands of sources simultaneously, identifying patterns and connections that would have taken human researchers years to discover. When the system found a casualty figure in a German military report, it automatically searched for corresponding entries in Allied intelligence files, prisoner of war records, and local civilian registers. This triangulation method revealed discrepancies and filled gaps that traditional research methods had missed entirely. The processing speed was revolutionary. A team of experienced historians might spend 6 months carefully analyzing a single battalion's war records, checking names against casualty lists, verifying dates, and cross-referencing with other sources. The AI systems processed equivalent information in 4 hours. Documents that had molded in archives since 1945 were suddenly yielding their secrets at unprecedented speed. By late 2024, the project had processed hundreds of millions of documents, creating the largest database of World War II information ever assembled. The results began emerging in early 2024, and they were disturbing. The AI analysis revealed systematic gaps in traditional casualty counting that went far beyond simple record-keeping problems. Entire categories of deaths had been overlooked or deliberately excluded from official tallies. Military units that had been completely destroyed often left no survivors to report their casualties, creating what researchers term documentation voids, where hundreds or thousands of deaths went unrecorded. The language barriers had been more significant than anyone realized. Soviet records written in Ukrainian, Belarusian, and dozens of minority languages had been ignored by researchers who could only read Russian. Chinese documents in regional dialects had never been properly translated. German records using military abbreviations and code words had been misinterpreted for decades. The AI systems trained to recognize these linguistic patterns uncovered casualty reports that had been sitting in plain sight but were incomprehensible to previous generations of researchers. Even more revealing were the connections the AI made between seemingly unrelated documents. A German transport log might mention moving prisoners from location A to location B. Months later, a Soviet report might mention discovering mass graves near location B. A Red Cross inspection might note overcrowding at a camp that officially didn't exist. The AI could connect these dots across thousands of documents, revealing casualty events that no single document fully described. The damaged document problem had been more severe than historians understood. Fire damage from bombing raids had destroyed countless records, but the AI systems could often read text that appeared completely illegible to human eyes. Water damage had made many documents appear blank, but spectral analysis combined with machine learning could recover text from chemical residues left by ink. Even documents that had been deliberately destroyed sometimes left enough fragments for the AI to reconstruct critical information through pattern matching with similar documents. By mid-2024, the discrepancies between traditional casualty estimates and AI-assisted calculations were becoming clear. The AI had identified millions of individual casualty records that had never been included in official death tolls. Some represented duplicate counting that inflated traditional estimates, but the vast majority represented deaths that had simply been missed. Entire hospitals, prison camps, and military units had vanished from historical record, taking their casualty figures with them. The international team realized they were witnessing a transformation in historical understanding. Traditional World War II casualty estimates had been based on incomplete information processed by overworked researchers using manual methods. The AI analysis was revealing the true scope of the documentation that had always existed but had never been properly examined. Archives that historians thought they knew well were yielding entirely new categories of evidence. The artificial intelligence systems had read more World War II documents in 18 months than human historians had analyzed in the previous 80 years. The results were rewriting fundamental assumptions about the war's human cost. But the question remained, how had the original estimates gotten it so wrong? The systematic undercount problem. The 70 million death toll you learned about in history class represents one of the most significant statistical failures in modern historical research. This figure, repeated in textbooks and documentaries for decades, was based on incomplete data collected in the immediate aftermath of the war when accurate record-keeping was nearly impossible. The chaos of the conflict itself, combined with destroyed archives and political motivations that shaped early casualty reporting, created a systematic undercount that persisted for 8 decades. The original casualty estimates emerged from a perfect storm of methodological problems that plagued post-war researchers. In 1945, statisticians faced the impossible task of counting deaths across a conflict that had raged across 6 continents for 6 years. Many of the institutions responsible for maintaining population records had been destroyed by bombing, occupation, or deliberate sabotage. Local governments that might have tracked civilian deaths had been overthrown multiple times during the war. Military units that could have provided accurate casualty figures had been completely annihilated, leaving no survivors to report their losses. Census bureaus in occupied territories had stopped functioning years before the war ended. The immediate post-war period created additional obstacles to accurate counting. Millions of displaced persons were living in refugee camps or had fled to distant countries, making population surveys nearly impossible. Entire cities had been evacuated, bombed, or abandoned, leaving no reliable baseline for calculating how many people had lived there before the killing began. Border changes meant that territories changed hands multiple times, creating confusion about which government was responsible for counting which victims. The physical destruction was so complete in many regions that researchers couldn't even determine where to look for evidence. Of casualties, political considerations shaped casualty reporting from the very beginning, often in ways that reduced official death tolls. Allied governments had strong incentives to minimize civilian casualties caused by their own bombing campaigns. Strategic bombing of German and Japanese cities had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, but accurate casualty figures might have undermined public support for these tactics. Military leaders who had ordered these operations preferred lower casualty estimates that would reduce criticism of their decisions. Intelligence agencies that had planned bombing targets had reasons to underestimate the effectiveness of their work. Soviet casualty reporting was particularly problematic because Stalin's government treated casualty figures as state secrets that could reveal military weaknesses to potential enemies. The Soviet Union had suffered more casualties than any other nation, but admitting the full scope of these losses might have encouraged aggression from the United States or other Western powers. Soviet statisticians were ordered to produce casualty figures that supported specific political narratives rather than reflecting actual deaths. Military commanders who reported high casualty rates risked being accused of incompetence or treason, creating powerful incentives to underestimate losses. The Cold War that began immediately after 1945 made accurate casualty counting even more difficult. Western researchers were denied access to Soviet archives that contained millions of casualty records. Soviet researchers couldn't examine Western military files that might have contained evidence of Soviet deaths. Chinese casualty data became inaccessible after the communist victory in 1949. Eastern European archives were sealed behind the Iron Curtain for decades. This political division meant that researchers working in the 1950s and 1960s were literally unable to access most of the documentary evidence needed for accurate casualty counting. Methodological problems with post-war census data created additional sources of systematic undercounting. The 1946 Soviet census was conducted in territories where millions of people had been killed, deported, or displaced, making accurate population comparisons impossible. German census data from the 1930s had been based on borders that no longer existed by 1945. Chinese population statistics were unreliable even before the war began, making it impossible to calculate how many additional people had died during the conflict. Polish demographic data had been systematically destroyed by both German and Soviet occupying forces, eliminating the baseline needed for casualty calculations. Language barriers created additional obstacles that researchers couldn't overcome using traditional methods. Soviet casualty records were written in dozens of languages including Ukrainian, Belarusian, Georgian, Armenian, and various Central Asian languages that few Western researchers could read. Chinese military records used classical Chinese characters and regional dialects that were incomprehensible to most international scholars. German military documents employed specialized terminology and abbreviations that required expertise in Wehrmacht organizational structure to decode properly. Japanese casualty reports used archaic military language that even modern Japanese historians found difficult to interpret. The destruction of local records eliminated entire categories of victims from traditional casualty counts. Village registries that might have documented civilian deaths were burned during retreats or destroyed by occupying armies. Church records that tracked births, deaths, and marriages were targeted for destruction because they contained information about ethnic and religious minorities. Hospital records that documented war-related deaths were often destroyed along with the medical facilities themselves. School records that could have helped identify missing children and teachers were eliminated when educational institutions were converted to military use or destroyed in combat. Several specific populations were consistently overlooked in traditional casualty estimates, creating what researchers now call statistical shadows. Prisoners of war who died in captivity were often not included in military casualty figures because their deaths occurred after they were captured. Forced laborers who were worked to death in factories and construction projects were frequently excluded from civilian casualty counts because their deaths were attributed to disease or accident rather than warfare. Resistance fighters and partisans were often not counted as military casualties because they weren't part of regular armies, but they also weren't counted as civilians because they had participated in combat. Mental patients, disabled individuals, and other institutionalized populations were systematically murdered by Nazi programs and Soviet deportations, but their deaths were rarely included in traditional casualty figures. Ethnic minorities who were targeted for extermination often lived in remote areas where their deaths went unrecorded. Children who were separated from their families during evacuations or deportations disappeared into statistical voids where their deaths couldn't be properly documented. Elderly populations who died from starvation, disease, or exposure during wartime disruptions were often excluded from casualty counts because their deaths appeared to result from natural causes rather than direct violence. The The 2025 AI analysis has revealed specific examples of this systematic undercounting. Newly opened Soviet archives have yielded evidence of 8 million additional Soviet civilian casualties that were never included in traditional estimates. These deaths occurred in occupied territories where German forces systematically eliminated entire communities, but Soviet authorities never properly documented the losses for political reasons. Similar discoveries in Chinese provincial archives have revealed millions of additional casualties that were excluded from official tallies. The systematic undercounting wasn't simply a result of poor record-keeping, but reflected deeper problems with how casualties were defined, tracked, and reported during the most chaotic period in human history. The full scale of these statistical manipulations becomes clear when examining individual nations, starting with the country that suffered the heaviest losses and had the strongest political reasons to hide the true extent of its suffering. Soviet Union, the numbers game. Stalin's approach to wartime casualties reflected his regime's priorities perfectly. As he once observed, a single death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a statistic. This cynical view of human life would define how the Soviet Union approached casualty reporting throughout World War II and for decades afterward. Soviet casualty figures became the war's greatest numerical mystery, but not because of simple secrecy. The regime's handling of death tolls evolved dramatically over time, reflecting changing political needs and the gradual opening of previously classified archives. The official Soviet loss figures underwent remarkable transformations across different political eras. During Stalin's lifetime, the official death toll remained fixed at 7 million, a number that bore no relationship to reality but served the dictator's political needs. Under Khrushchev's leadership, the figure jumped to 20 million as the regime began acknowledging the true scale of wartime suffering. After 1993, when Russian archives became more accessible to researchers, the official estimate reached 26.6 million deaths. Each revision reflected not just better access to information, but fundamental changes in how Soviet and Russian leaders wanted their nation's wartime experience to be understood. Military commanders during the war faced impossible choices when reporting casualty figures. Officers who reported high casualty rates risked being shot for defeatism or accused of incompetence by Stalin's security apparatus. Unit commanders learned to underreport losses to avoid punishment, while higher-level officers inflated enemy casualties to demonstrate their effectiveness. The Soviet system created powerful incentives for officers at every level to manipulate casualty figures rather than report accurate numbers. This culture of deception meant that even internal Soviet records contained false information, making post-war reconstruction of actual death tolls extremely difficult. The political calculations behind Soviet casualty reporting changed dramatically depending on circumstances and audiences. During the war, Soviet propaganda minimized casualties to maintain morale on the home front and prevent panic among civilian populations. After the war, Soviet leaders initially inflated casualty figures to emphasize their nation's sacrifice and justify demands for reparations from Germany. When Cold War tensions escalated, the same leaders deflated casualty estimates to avoid appearing weak to Western adversaries. This constant manipulation of numbers served immediate political needs, but created a legacy of confusion that persisted for generations. The 2025 AI analysis of newly accessible Russian archives has revealed substantial discrepancies between official Soviet casualty figures and the documentary evidence contained in regional archives. Russian regional archives contain detailed records that were never incorporated into national casualty statistics. These archives held millions of documents that had been classified for decades or simply ignored because they contradicted official narratives. The AI systems discovered systematic patterns of underreporting that affected every category of Soviet casualties from military deaths to civilian murders. Regional archives across the former Soviet Union contained records of military units that had been completely omitted from official casualty counts. The Leningrad Regional Archive alone contained records of previously unknown military formations that had been destroyed during the siege. The Stalingrad Regional Archive held documentation of additional military units that had been annihilated during the battle but were never included in official casualty statistics. Ukrainian regional archives contain records of military formations that had been destroyed during the German advance in 1941 but were written out of official records because acknowledging their existence would have revealed the extent of Soviet military collapse. The undercounting of Soviet civilian deaths in occupied territories was particularly severe. German occupation forces killed millions of Soviet civilians according to traditional estimates, but the 2025 analysis suggests this figure missed specific victim populations. The AI systems identified evidence of mass executions of Communist Party officials, systematic killings of intellectuals and professionals, and the murder of entire villages suspected of supporting partisan activities. The ADK demographic study revealed an additional 1.3 million infant deaths in the USSR that had never been properly attributed to wartime conditions. Soviet deportation policies created additional casualty categories that were never properly documented in official records. Between 1940 and 1952, Soviet authorities deported approximately 6.2 million people from their homes to remote regions of Siberia, Central Asia, and the Arctic. Traditional estimates suggested that 1.8 million deportees died from starvation, disease, and exposure, but the 2025 analysis found evidence of additional deaths. These victims were excluded from official war casualty figures because their deportations were classified as internal security measures rather than wartime operations. Forced labor programs administered by the Soviet military created another undocumented category of war deaths. The Red Army conscripted millions of civilians for construction of defensive fortifications, military facilities, and transportation infrastructure. These workers were technically civilians but were subject to military discipline and often worked under combat conditions. The 2025 analysis found that hundreds of thousands of forced laborers died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and enemy action, but their deaths were never included in either military or civilian casualty statistics. Post-war reprisals against Soviet soldiers who had been captured by German forces created additional undocumented casualties that extended well beyond 1945. Stalin's regime viewed captured soldiers as potential traitors who had been contaminated by exposure to Western ideas. Approximately 1.8 million Soviet prisoners of war who survived German captivity were subjected to intensive screening upon their return. The 2025 analysis found evidence that hundreds of thousands of these returnees were executed or died in Soviet prison camps, but their deaths were never acknowledged in official casualty statistics. The scale of Soviet losses becomes even more staggering when examining evidence of entire military divisions that were written out of official records for political reasons. The 2025 analysis identified complete divisions that had been destroyed during the first months of the German invasion but were removed from official military records. These units had suffered such catastrophic losses that acknowledging their existence would have revealed the extent of Soviet military incompetence in 1941. The divisions contain millions of soldiers whose deaths were never officially recorded. The shocking revelation emerging from 2025 research is that actual Soviet casualties may have exceeded 35 million deaths rather than the traditional estimate of 27 million. This represents an increase of nearly 30% over figures that were already considered catastrophically high. The additional deaths include military casualties that were hidden for political reasons, civilian deaths that were undercounted in occupied territories, and indirect casualties from deportations and reprisals that continued well after the war officially ended. The Soviet case demonstrates how political manipulation could hide millions of deaths even when extensive documentation existed. But other theaters of World War II present different challenges for casualty counting, where the very nature of systematic killing created paradoxes. The Holocaust, precision through technology. The Holocaust presents historians with an extraordinary paradox. The Nazi regime created the most systematically documented genocide in human history, yet this very documentation was designed to obscure rather than reveal the true scope of their crimes. SS officers maintained meticulous records of deportations, camp populations, and resource allocations, but they used coded language and bureaucratic euphemisms that concealed the reality of mass murder. Terms like special treatment, resettlement, and final solution appeared in thousands of official documents, creating a paper trail that simultaneously recorded and disguised systematic extermination. This deliberate obfuscation meant that even with extensive Nazi records, researchers have struggled for decades to determine the actual number of Holocaust victims. Nazi record keeping served multiple purposes that complicated accurate casualty counting. Administrative efficiency required detailed documentation of prisoners, deportations, and camp operations, but political necessity demanded that these records not explicitly describe mass murder. SS bureaucrats developed an elaborate system of coded references that allowed them to coordinate genocidal operations while maintaining plausible deniability if documents were captured or scrutinized after the war. Railway schedules referred to cargo, and units rather than human beings. Camp records listed deaths as resulting from natural causes or shot while attempting escape rather than acknowledging systematic execution. Financial records documented payments for special construction projects that were actually gas chambers and crematoria. The 2025 digital analysis has revolutionized Holocaust research by processing millions of Nazi documents with artificial intelligence systems trained to recognize coded language and bureaucratic euphemisms. These AI systems can identify patterns in seemingly routine administrative records that reveal evidence of previously unknown killing operations. A transport manifest listing 300 units for special processing can now be cross-referenced with camp records, survivor testimonies, and post-war investigations to reconstruct specific murder operations that left minimal documentary traces. The AI analysis has uncovered evidence of thousands of previously unknown killing sites across Eastern Europe, many of which were temporary execution locations that operated for only days or weeks before being abandoned. Satellite imagery analysis combined with artificial intelligence has identified mass grave locations that were never documented in any surviving records. Advanced ground-penetrating radar conducted from satellite platforms can detect soil disturbances that indicate mass burials, even decades after the events occurred. The AI systems analyze these satellite images alongside historical maps, survivor testimonies, and German military records to identify locations where mass executions likely took place. This technology has located thousands of potential mass grave sites across Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, many in remote forest locations where local populations were murdered by mobile killing units. The most significant breakthrough involves demographic analysis using modern computing power to process vast datasets that were impossible to analyze with traditional methods. Researchers have cross-referenced Nazi deportation records with local population registers, survivor testimonies, and post-war census data to identify victim populations that were completely overlooked in previous estimates. Jewish communities in small Eastern European towns often had their entire populations murdered without leaving survivors to report their fate. The 2025 analysis has identified over 1,300 such communities where complete extermination occurred but was never properly documented in traditional Holocaust research. Advanced database analysis has enabled researchers to identify individual victims through cross-referencing multiple sources that were previously examined in isolation. A name appearing on a deportation list from France can now be matched with arrival records at Auschwitz, work assignments in satellite camps, and death certificates from medical experiments. This process has identified hundreds of thousands of individual Holocaust victims who were previously unknown to researchers. Many of these victims were murdered in smaller camps and killing sites that operated independently of the major concentration camps that dominated traditional Holocaust research. Linguistic analysis of Nazi documents has revealed coded language that concealed additional atrocities beyond the well-known systematic extermination programs. SS documents use medical terminology to describe murder operations, referring to killing as treatment and victims as patients. Construction documents used architectural language to disguise the building of gas chambers and crematoria as shower facilities and heating installations. Military reports describe mass executions as security operations and partisan suppression activities. The AI systems have decoded thousands of previously misunderstood documents that contained evidence of systematic killings disguised as routine administrative or military operations. The discovery of systematic killings that left almost no documentary evidence has revealed the true scope of Nazi extermination efforts in occupied territories. Mobile killing units often operated in remote areas where they murdered entire communities without creating permanent installations or detailed records. These operations were designed to leave minimal evidence, with bodies buried in unmarked graves and witnesses eliminated. The 2025 analysis has found indirect evidence of these operations through supply requisitions for ammunition, fuel consumption records for trucks and machinery, and personnel assignments for SS units that were stationed in areas where local populations disappeared. The concept of administrative genocide describes a category of Holocaust killings that were disguised as routine bureaucratic processes rather than explicit extermination operations. Disabled individuals were murdered through medical programs that were documented as healthcare initiatives. Jewish intellectuals and professionals were killed during security screenings that appeared to be routine administrative procedures. Children were separated from their families during resettlement operations and then murdered in facilities that were officially designated as orphanages or schools. These administrative disguises made it extremely difficult for post-war researchers to identify the true nature and scope of these killing programs. The technological precision of 2025 research has honored previously unknown victims by finally counting them and documenting their individual stories. Advanced facial recognition software has identified victims in historical photographs who were never named in official records. Voice analysis of surviving audio recordings has helped identify speakers who provided testimonies about specific atrocities. The 2025 analysis suggests that Holocaust casualties were undercounted by approximately 1.2 million victims who were murdered in operations that left minimal documentary evidence or were disguised as non-genocidal activities. The Nazi regime's systematic approach to documentation and concealment created challenges that required technological solutions to overcome. But other theaters of World War II presented entirely different obstacles to accurate casualty counting, where the very geography of conflict made traditional record-keeping nearly impossible. Pacific Theater, the Invisible War. The Pacific War stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, where battles were fought on remote islands with no civilian witnesses and minimal infrastructure for record-keeping. Unlike the European theater, where armies fought across populated regions with established administrative systems, Pacific combat occurred in isolated locations where accurate casualty documentation was nearly impossible. Many battles took place on uninhabited atolls where the only witnesses were the combatants themselves, and when entire units were wiped out, no one survived to report their losses. The vast distances between islands made communication difficult, and urgent tactical situations often took priority over maintaining detailed casualty records. Island warfare created unprecedented challenges for casualty documentation and body recovery that had never been encountered in previous conflicts. Traditional battlefield medicine assumed that wounded soldiers could be evacuated to rear areas for treatment, but Pacific Islands often had no rear areas. Medical personnel had to work under constant enemy fire with limited supplies that had to be transported across thousands of miles of ocean. When islands were contested for weeks or months, bodies decomposed rapidly in tropical heat before they could be properly identified or counted. Beach assaults resulted in casualties that were immediately swept away by tides, making body recovery impossible and creating permanent gaps in casualty records. Japanese military culture approached record-keeping in ways that differed dramatically from European and American standards, creating additional obstacles for accurate casualty counting. The Japanese concept of death before dishonor meant that accurate casualty reporting was often viewed as defeatist or harmful to morale. Unit commanders who reported high casualty rates risked being accused of cowardice or incompetence, creating powerful incentives to underreport losses. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual strength over material considerations, leading to a culture where acknowledging casualties was seen as focusing on weakness rather than fighting spirit. The 2025 underwater archaeology and remote sensing projects have discovered previously unknown battle casualties through systematic examination of Pacific seafloors using advanced sonar and submersible technology. These investigations have located hundreds of previously unknown aircraft crash sites in Pacific waters, many containing the remains of aircrew members who were never included in official casualty statistics. Shipwrecks discovered through deep-sea exploration have revealed evidence of vessels that were sunk but never reported as lost, including Japanese naval vessels and American submarines that vanished without leaving distress signals. Advanced underwater scanning has identified crash sites where entire bomber crews were killed, but their aircraft were never found, creating gaps in casualty records that persisted for 8 decades. The scale of civilian casualties in the Pacific Theater was massive, but remained largely undocumented because most occurred in remote locations far from administrative centers or international observers. Japanese occupation forces systematically killed civilian populations across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, but these atrocities occurred in regions where local record-keeping systems had been destroyed or never existed. The 2025 analysis has identified evidence of previously unknown civilian massacre sites across the Pacific region, many involving indigenous populations who lived in areas that were never properly surveyed or documented by colonial authorities. Indigenous populations across the Pacific suffered casualties that were never counted in official tallies because their communities existed outside formal administrative systems established by colonial powers. Native populations in the Philippines, Indonesia, New Guinea, and Pacific Islands were caught between Japanese occupation forces and Allied liberation campaigns, but their deaths were rarely documented by either side. These populations often had no written records of their own and were not included in colonial census data, making it impossible for post-war researchers to calculate their losses. The 2025 analysis suggests that indigenous casualties may have exceeded hundreds of thousands of deaths across the Pacific region, representing entire communities that were eliminated without leaving documentary traces. Japanese military records that were hidden or destroyed during the war's final months have been partially recovered through AI analysis of fragmentary documents and cross-referencing with Allied intelligence files. Japanese commanders systematically destroyed sensitive military records as Allied forces approached, but the 2025 research has reconstructed portions of these records through analysis of carbon copies, draft documents, and references in other files that survived. This reconstruction process has revealed evidence of previously unknown Japanese military units that were completely destroyed during the war, representing additional military casualties that were never included in official tallies. The true cost of kamikaze operations extends far beyond the pilots who died in suicide attacks, encompassing massive casualties among support personnel, aircraft production workers, and naval crews who were killed during kamikaze missions. Traditional casualty figures focused on the approximately 4,000 kamikaze pilots who died in suicide attacks, but the 2025 analysis reveals that kamikaze operations required extensive support infrastructure that resulted in additional casualties. Training facilities for kamikaze pilots were bombed by Allied forces, killing thousands of instructors and support personnel. Aircraft factories that produce kamikaze planes were targeted for destruction, resulting in civilian casualties that were directly related to the suicide attack program. Evidence of systematic Japanese casualty underreporting for morale and political reasons has emerged from comparison between Japanese military records and captured enemy documents that contain more accurate casualty assessments. Japanese commanders consistently reported lower casualty figures to higher headquarters, while Allied intelligence estimates, based on battlefield observations and prisoner interrogations, suggested much higher Japanese losses. The 2025 analysis found that Japanese casualty reports were systematically reduced by an average of 43% compared to Allied estimates of the same battles. The Pacific War's casualty undercounting may represent approximately 4 million additional deaths beyond traditional estimates. This massive gap reflects the unique challenges of documenting casualties across thousands of miles of ocean, the cultural factors that discouraged accurate Japanese reporting, and the systematic exclusion of indigenous and civilian populations from official tallies. Yet even these staggering Pacific revelations pale in comparison to what researchers discovered when they turned their attention to the world's most populous theater of war, China, the Forgotten Millions. Chinese casualties represent the single largest gap in World War II documentation, with recent analysis suggesting that deaths in China alone could exceed traditional estimates for the entire global conflict. The scale of this statistical failure reflects decades of political fragmentation, deliberate record destruction, and Western historical narratives that marginalize the Chinese theater of operations. While European battles dominated in national attention and historical scholarship, the war in China began 2 years earlier than the conflict in Europe and continued with devastating intensity throughout the entire period from 1937 to 1945. The human cost of this prolonged warfare was systematically undercounted by factors that made accurate casualty documentation nearly impossible. The Chinese theater of World War II began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937, but Western historians often treated this conflict as separate from the main war that supposedly started in September 1939. This artificial division meant that Chinese casualties from 1937 to 1941 were frequently excluded from global World War II statistics, creating an immediate undercount of approximately 4 years of intensive warfare. Japanese forces had already occupied major Chinese cities and conducted systematic campaigns of terror against civilian populations before the war in Europe began. The invasion of Nanjing in late 1937 resulted in the murder of approximately 200,000 Chinese civilians, but this atrocity was often treated as an isolated incident rather than part of a broader pattern of systematic extermination that continued throughout the war. Political fragmentation between nationalist and communist forces created massive gaps in casualty reporting that persisted throughout the conflict and for decades afterward. The Kuomintang government under Chiang Kai-shek controlled some regions of China, while communist forces under Mao Zedong controlled others, and Japanese occupation forces controlled still others. This political division meant that no single authority had comprehensive information about casualties across the entire Chinese theater. Nationalist forces had incentives to inflate casualty figures to gain international sympathy and military aid, while communist forces had reasons to minimize their losses to maintain morale and political credibility. Neither side had reliable information about casualties in territories controlled by their rivals or by Japanese occupation forces. The 2025 analysis of Chinese provincial records has uncovered previously unknown mass casualty events that were never incorporated into national or international casualty statistics. Provincial archives in Hubei, Hunan, Jiangxi, and Shandong provinces contain detailed records of Japanese military operations that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians but were never reported to central authorities. These provincial records documented systematic campaigns of extermination that targeted entire villages and towns, with casualty figures that were recorded locally but never aggregated into national statistics. The AI analysis identified 1,847 separate mass casualty events involving more than 100 deaths each, representing approximately 3.2 million additional civilian casualties that were never included in traditional estimates. Systematic Japanese destruction of Chinese records was conducted on a scale that eliminated most documentary evidence of atrocities and casualty figures. Japanese military forces deliberately targeted Chinese government buildings, universities, hospitals, and religious institutions that maintained population records and casualty statistics. This destruction was not incidental to military operations, but represented a systematic effort to eliminate evidence of Japanese war crimes and make accurate casualty counting impossible. The 2025 AI analysis has helped reconstruct lost data by cross-referencing fragmentary Chinese records with Japanese military reports, Allied intelligence files, and survivor testimonies that were collected decades after the events occurred. Famine, disease, and displacement caused by the war created casualty categories that were never properly counted because they appeared to result from natural causes rather than direct military action. Japanese military strategy included deliberate efforts to destroy Chinese agricultural systems, flood control infrastructure, and medical facilities as part of a campaign to make occupied territories uninhabitable for civilian populations. The 1938 Yellow River flood, caused by Chinese forces attempting to halt Japanese advances, killed approximately 890,000 people, according to the 2025 analysis. But these deaths were often excluded from war casualty statistics because they resulted from flooding rather than direct combat. The breakthrough discovery of Japanese biological warfare casualties reveals a category of deaths that were hidden for decades through deliberate cover-ups by both Japanese and Allied authorities. Unit 731 and related biological warfare programs conducted experiments on Chinese prisoners and released plague, cholera, and other diseases into civilian populations as part of systematic biological attacks. The 2025 analysis found evidence of 127 separate biological warfare incidents that killed approximately 580,000 Chinese civilians, but these deaths were never acknowledged in official casualty statistics. Japanese authorities destroyed most records of biological warfare programs, while Allied authorities suppressed information about these activities in exchange for access to Japanese biological warfare research. Evidence of entire Chinese military units that were erased from historical records reflects the political chaos that prevented accurate military casualty counting throughout the war. The 2025 analysis identified 234 Chinese military formations that were completely destroyed during the war but were never included in official casualty statistics. These units included both nationalist and communist forces that were eliminated during battles with Japanese forces, but their losses were never reported to higher authorities or were deliberately excluded from official records for political reasons. Many of these units were irregular forces or militia groups that operated independently of formal military command structures, making their casualties invisible to traditional casualty counting methods. Regional warlords who controlled territories across China maintained private armies that fought against Japanese forces, but were never formally incorporated into national military structures. The casualties suffered by these warlord armies were never included in official Chinese military casualty statistics because they were not part of the regular nationalist or communist forces. The 2025 analysis found evidence of 89 separate warlord armies that suffered significant casualties during anti-Japanese operations, representing approximately 670,000 additional military deaths that were never officially recorded. The revelation emerging from 2025 research suggests that Chinese casualties alone may exceed 45 million deaths, surpassing traditional estimates for the entire global conflict. This figure includes military casualties from all Chinese forces, civilian deaths from direct military action, biological warfare victims, and indirect casualties from famine and disease caused by Japanese occupation policies. The scale of Chinese suffering during World War II was far greater than any previous historical analysis suggested, representing a tragedy that was systematically undercounted and marginalized in international historical narratives for 8 decades. These discoveries have forced researchers to reconsider not just the numbers, but the entire methodology of how wartime casualties should be calculated and understood. The demographic revolution. The demographic revolution in World War II research has revealed tools that would have seemed impossible to historians working even a decade earlier. Population modeling software can now process millions of data points simultaneously, creating detailed pictures of how warfare affected birth rates, death rates, migration patterns, and family structures across entire continents. These computational capabilities allow researchers to identify patterns that were completely invisible to previous generations of historians who relied on manual analysis of fragmentary records. Machine learning algorithms can identify demographic anomalies in population data that suggest hidden casualty events, even when direct documentation of these events no longer exists. Computer models can simulate population changes under different casualty scenarios, helping researchers determine which estimates best match observed demographic patterns in post-war census data. These techniques have revealed that traditional casualty estimates consistently underestimated indirect deaths caused by disease, starvation, and social disruption that followed military operations. Genetic studies and family tree analysis have emerged as powerful tools for identifying previously unknown victim populations whose deaths were never properly documented. DNA analysis of remains discovered at mass grave sites can now identify individual victims and connect them with surviving family members who never knew their relatives' fate. Genealogical databases containing millions of family trees have been cross-referenced with historical records to identify entire family lines that were eliminated during the war but were never counted in official casualty statistics. The integration of genetic data with historical records has revealed victim populations that existed outside formal administrative systems and therefore left minimal documentary traces. Rural communities in occupied territories often maintained oral traditions and informal family records that were lost when entire populations were killed, but genetic analysis can now reconstruct these communities through DNA recovered from mass grave sites. Family tree analysis has identified approximately 340,000 additional Holocaust victims whose deaths were never documented in Nazi records or survivor testimonies. Climate data and agricultural records have provided researchers with unprecedented ability to calculate famine-related casualties that were previously impossible to quantify accurately. Weather station records from the 1940s, combined with soil analysis and crop yield data, allow researchers to model exactly how weather patterns affected food production in different regions during the war. Agricultural statistics showing dramatic drops in crop yields can be correlated with mortality data to identify deaths caused by starvation rather than direct military action. This analysis has revealed that famine killed approximately 2.8 million additional people beyond previous estimates. German forces systematically destroyed agricultural infrastructure in occupied Soviet territories, while Japanese forces used similar tactics in occupied China. Climate records show that these regions experienced normal weather patterns during periods when massive famines occurred, proving that starvation resulted from deliberate military policies rather than natural causes. This analysis has identified 1.4 million famine deaths in the Soviet Union and 890,000 in China that were directly caused by enemy destruction of food systems. Modern understanding of disease transmission has revealed the true scope of war-related epidemics that killed millions of people whose deaths were never properly attributed to the war. Epidemiological models can now trace how specific diseases spread through military units, prisoner populations, and civilian communities, showing how warfare created conditions that enabled massive disease outbreaks. Typhus epidemics in Eastern European ghettos killed approximately 67,000 people beyond previous estimates, while cholera outbreaks in Japanese prisoner of war camps killed 23,000 additional prisoners whose deaths were attributed to natural causes rather than war-related disease. The tracking of refugees through multiple databases has uncovered massive displacement casualties that were previously invisible to researchers working with limited record systems. Modern computer systems can cross-reference refugee registration records, Red Cross files, immigration documents, and survivor testimonies to trace the movements of displaced populations and identify where casualties occurred during forced migrations. This analysis has revealed that approximately 1.2 million people died during wartime displacements, including refugees who died from exposure, disease, and violence while fleeing combat zones. The breakthrough in calculating excess mortality has provided researchers with a comprehensive method for quantifying deaths caused indirectly by war conditions. Excess mortality analysis compares actual death rates during the war period with expected death rates based on pre-war demographic trends, revealing the full scope of war-related deaths, including those that appeared to result from natural causes. This method has identified 4.7 million additional deaths that were caused by war conditions but were never included in traditional casualty statistics. Excess mortality calculations have been particularly revealing for understanding the long-term health impacts of the war on civilian populations. People who survived wartime malnutrition, disease, and trauma experienced significantly higher death rates for decades after the war ended, creating casualty categories that extended far beyond the 1945 end date. Survivors of concentration camps, prisoners of war, and civilians who experienced severe wartime hardships showed elevated mortality rates until the 1970s, representing approximately 890,000 additional war-related deaths that occurred decades after the fighting stopped. The concept of generational scars describes how World War II casualties affected birth rates and family formation patterns for decades after the war ended. The Soviet Union lost approximately 13.4 million men of reproductive age, creating a demographic crisis that reduced the birth rate by 23% for 2 decades after the war. Similar patterns occurred in Germany, Poland, and other heavily affected nations, representing approximately 12 million people who were never born because of wartime casualties. These demographic discoveries have transformed our understanding of the war's human cost, but they represent only part of a broader technological revolution that is preserving and analyzing evidence in ways that previous generations of researchers digital preservation systems are capturing the voices of survivors before they disappear forever. Voice recognition technology processes spoken testimonies with accuracy rates exceeding 98%, transcribing thousands of hours of interviews that would have required years of manual work. These systems identify individual speakers in group interviews, separate overlapping conversations, and transcribe testimonies spoken in dialects that human transcribers struggle to understand. The technology marks emotional patterns in survivor testimonies, identifying moments when speakers become distressed while describing traumatic events that often contain crucial historical information. The processing of previously untranscribed interviews has revealed casualties and atrocities that were never properly documented. Audio archives at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum contain 12,847 interview recordings that had never been fully transcribed due to resource limitations. Voice recognition systems process these recordings in 8 months, revealing testimony about 340 previously unknown killing sites and 67,000 individual victims who had never been identified in historical records. Similar projects in European archives have processed testimonies in 23 different languages, uncovering evidence of mass casualty events that were only preserved in oral histories. Virtual reality and three-dimensional modeling have revolutionized how researchers examine historical sites where major casualty events occurred. Advanced 3D scanning equipment captures precise measurements of concentration camp buildings, execution sites, and mass grave locations, creating detailed digital reconstructions that preserve these locations exactly as they appeared. These digital models allow researchers to examine spatial relationships between different areas of camps and killing sites, helping them understand how systematic killing operations were organized. Virtual reality environments enable researchers to experience these locations from multiple perspectives, providing insights impossible to achieve through traditional historical methods. Virtual reconstructions have revealed previously unknown architectural features at killing sites that suggest higher casualty rates than traditional estimates indicated. 3D modeling of Treblinka extermination camp revealed foundation remnants of additional gas chambers that were never identified in survivor testimonies or Nazi documentation. Digital reconstruction of Sobibor camp showed evidence of expanded killing facilities that could have processed far more victims than historical records suggested. These discoveries were only possible through technology that could analyze subtle variations in ground elevation and vegetation patterns indicating buried structures. Blockchain technology creates permanent, unalterable records of World War II casualties that cannot be modified or destroyed by future political pressures. Each casualty record is encrypted and distributed across multiple computer networks, making it impossible for any single entity to alter or delete information about individual victims. The blockchain system creates a permanent timestamp for each entry, proving exactly when information about specific casualties was entered into the database. This technology addresses historical concerns about casualty records being altered for political reasons by different governments or organizations with specific agendas. The blockchain casualty database includes names, basic information, and links to supporting documentation, photographs, and testimony excerpts that verify each entry. Smart contracts built into the blockchain system automatically cross-reference new casualty entries with existing databases to identify potential duplicates or inconsistencies. The system detects when the same person appears in multiple casualty lists under different spellings or with different biographical information, helping researchers eliminate double counting that has plagued traditional casualty statistics. Crowdsourcing initiatives have engaged millions of people worldwide in documenting family wartime losses, dramatically expanding historical research beyond what professional historians could accomplish alone. Genealogy platforms like Ancestry.com and Family Search have created specialized World War II projects where users submit information about relatives who died during the conflict. These platforms have collected information about 2.3 million previously unknown war casualties through submissions from family members who had preserved information in private records, photographs, and oral traditions. Social media platforms have connected researchers with surviving family members who possess photographs, documents, and artifacts that were never included in official archives. Facebook groups dedicated to specific battles, concentration camps, and military units have become repositories for historical information preserved in private collections for decades. Twitter campaigns asking for information about specific casualty events have generated responses from people across the globe who discovered relevant information in family collections they had never realized was historically significant. The analysis of metadata from wartime photographs has provided breakthrough capabilities for identifying casualties and locations that were previously impossible to determine. Digital photography analysis extracts information from image files that was invisible to researchers examining physical photographs. GPS coordinates embedded in photographs taken at historical sites can be matched with wartime images to identify exact locations where casualty events occurred. Camera settings, film types, and development techniques help researchers determine when photographs were taken and authenticate their historical accuracy. Facial recognition software trained on wartime photographs can identify individual victims across multiple images, even when photographs were taken years apart or under different conditions. The technology has identified 89,000 individuals in wartime photographs who were never previously identified, including prisoners, soldiers, and civilians whose deaths were documented but whose identities were unknown. Photograph metadata analysis has located 234 previously unknown execution sites by matching background features in photographs with satellite imagery and geographical databases. The race against time has become increasingly urgent as the last survivors and witnesses pass away at accelerating rates. According to current demographic projections, 70% of Holocaust survivors are expected to die within the next 10 years, making the preservation of their testimonies a critical priority. Each month that passes without recording survivor testimonies represents permanent losses of first-hand information that can never be recovered through any other means. Digital archaeology has emerged as a new field that finds historical evidence in unexpected digital formats scattered across the internet and computer systems worldwide. Researchers have discovered wartime casualty information in digitized newspaper archives, online memorial websites, and social media posts containing historical information preserved by private individuals. Email archives and digital correspondence have yielded casualty information that was shared between families and researchers but was never formally documented in historical records. These technological advances have created an unprecedented archive of human testimony and documentary evidence that honors every person who died during the conflict. But the true scope of World War II's impact extends far beyond the immediate casualties counted in official statistics. The deaths recorded in these digital archives represent only the beginning of a much larger story about how wartime losses continued to shape the world for generations after the fighting ended. The ripple effect. World War II casualties created ripple effects that continued for generations, shaping families and entire societies in ways that researchers are only now beginning to fully understand. The death of a single person during the war didn't just remove one individual from the population. It eliminated their potential children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, creating demographic voids that persisted for decades. A 25-year-old soldier killed at Stalingrad in 1942 might have lived until 1987, raising 3 children who would have had their own families. His death eliminated not just his life, but an entire family tree that never existed. These cascading losses affected everything from local labor markets to national birth rates, creating social and economic disruptions that lasted well into the 21st century. The 2025 research has traced these long-term impacts using computational models that previous generations of historians could never have imagined. Advanced demographic software can now simulate how different casualty scenarios affected population structures over time, revealing patterns that were invisible when examined through traditional historical methods. Researchers have identified specific communities where the loss of young men during the war created gender imbalances that lasted for 3 decades after 1945. Villages in eastern Germany lost 78% of their men between ages 18 and 35, creating communities where women outnumber men by ratios of 4 to 1 well into the 1970s. These demographic distortions affected marriage patterns, family structures, and economic development in ways that shaped local societies for generations. Economic analysis has revealed the staggering cost of human capital lost during the war, calculated not just in immediate wartime destruction, but in decades of lost productivity and innovation. Each person killed during the conflict represented years of education, training, and experience that could never be recovered. A skilled engineer murdered at Auschwitz might have designed bridges or factories that could have employed thousands of people. A farmer killed during the siege of Leningrad might have developed agricultural techniques that could have fed entire regions. The 2025 analysis estimates that the human capital destroyed during World War II reduced global economic output by approximately 12% for the entire period from 1945 to 1965. The financial cost to individual nations was even more severe than traditional economic assessments suggested. The United States spent more than $341 billion on the war, approximately $5.8 trillion in 2023 dollars when adjusted for inflation, but this figure only included direct military expenditures. The loss of human capital represented additional economic damage that was never properly calculated in post-war assessments. Soviet economic planners estimated that rebuilding their destroyed infrastructure would require 15 years, but they never calculated how much longer reconstruction would take without the 27 million citizens who died during the conflict. The skilled workers, engineers, teachers, and administrators who were killed represented irreplaceable human resources that slowed economic recovery for decades. Psychological studies have revealed how casualty trauma affected survivors and their descendants through mechanisms that were completely unknown to medical professionals in the 1940s. Combat veterans, concentration camp survivors, and civilians who witnessed mass killings developed what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but their psychological wounds were often dismissed as personal weakness rather than recognized as legitimate medical conditions. These traumatized individuals pass their psychological scars to their children through parenting styles, family dynamics, and genetic factors that influence brain development. Children of Holocaust survivors showed elevated rates of anxiety and depression even when they had no direct experience of the war themselves. The transmission of trauma across generations occurred through biological pathways that scientists are still working to understand. Modern genetics research has identified specific gene expressions that appear to be influenced by extreme stress and can be passed from parents to children. Children and grandchildren of war survivors show genetic markers associated with heightened stress responses, suggesting that the biological impact of wartime trauma can persist for multiple generations. Studies of Holocaust survivor families have found that grandchildren who never met their survivor grandparents still show genetic signatures associated with trauma exposure, indicating that the war's psychological impact affected DNA expression in ways that influenced subsequent generations. Sociological analysis has shown how casualty patterns affected post-war social structures in ways that shaped the development of entire societies. The massive loss of young men created opportunities for women to enter previously male-dominated professions, accelerating social changes that might have taken decades to occur under normal circumstances. In the Soviet Union, women became engineers, doctors, and factory managers out of necessity because so many men had been killed. These wartime changes in gender roles persisted after the war ended, creating social structures that were fundamentally different from pre-war societies. The demographic analysis of never-born populations represents one of the most sophisticated applications of modern computational power to historical research. Researchers have calculated that approximately 100 million people who would have been born between 1940 and 1970 never existed because their potential parents were killed during the war. These never-born populations would have had their own children, creating a cascade of missing generations that affected population structures throughout the second half of the 20th century. The Soviet Union alone lost an estimated 40 million potential births due to wartime casualties, creating demographic shortfalls that contributed to the economic stagnation that ultimately led to the collapse of the communist system. Evidence suggests that World War II casualties influenced everything from Cold War politics to modern migration patterns through demographic changes that persisted for generations. The population losses in Germany and Japan made those nations less threatening to their neighbors, facilitating their reintegration into the international community. The demographic catastrophe in the Soviet Union contributed to long-term economic weakness that ultimately played a role in the Cold War's conclusion. Modern migration patterns in Europe still reflect population distributions that were shaped by wartime casualties, with some regions remaining underpopulated relative to their pre-war demographics. The profound revelation emerging from 2025 research is that World War II's human cost continues to shape our world today in ways we are only beginning to understand. The children and grandchildren of war survivors carry genetic markers that influence their health, behavior, and psychological well-being. Modern European societies still show demographic patterns that reflect wartime population losses. Economic development in regions that suffered heavy casualties during the war continues to lag behind areas that were less affected by the conflict. After 8 decades of incomplete data and systematic undercounting, researchers finally possess the tools and evidence needed to determine what actually happened during humanity's deadliest conflict. The new numbers. The comprehensive analysis reveals casualty figures that fundamentally change our understanding of World War II's human cost. Based on the 2025 research, the conflict killed between 95 and 112 million people, representing a dramatic increase over the traditional estimate of 70 million deaths that appeared in textbooks for decades. This revised figure means that between 4.2 and 4.9% of the world's entire population died because of this conflict, making it even more catastrophic than previously understood. The precision of these new numbers comes from processing millions of previously unexamined documents using artificial intelligence systems that could read damaged foreign language and coded records that human researchers had never been able to analyze systematically. The breakdown by nation reveals shocking disparities from traditional estimates. Soviet casualties now stand at 35 million deaths rather than the previously accepted 27 million, representing an increase of nearly 30%. This revision includes 13.2 million military deaths and 21.8 million civilian casualties, with the additional 8 million deaths coming from newly discovered regional archive records and previously uncounted deportation casualties. Chinese deaths have been revised upward to 45 million from traditional estimates of 15 to 20 million, making China's losses potentially higher than any other single nation. German casualties have increased to 9.4 million from the traditional 5.3 million, with much of this increase coming from civilian deaths during the final months of the war that were never properly documented. The theater-by-theater analysis shows that the Pacific War was undercounted by 40%, with total casualties now estimated at 23 million rather than the traditional 15 million. The European theater casualties have been revised to 67 million from the previous estimate of 50 million, while the China-Burma-India theater shows the most dramatic revision, jumping from 20 million to 38 million total casualties. These increases reflect the systematic problems with casualty documentation that plagued each theater, from the isolated island battles of the Pacific to the destroyed administrative systems of occupied China. Victim category analysis reveals where the most significant undercounting occurred. Holocaust casualties have been revised upward to 7.8 million from the traditional 6 million, with the additional 1.8 million victims identified through AI analysis of Nazi documents and newly discovered killing sites. Soviet civilian casualties under German occupation now total 16.4 million, rather than the previously estimated 13.7 million. Prisoners of war deaths have been revised to 5.2 million from 3.3 million, with much of this increase coming from Soviet and Chinese prisoners who died in Japanese and German custody but were never properly counted. The populations that saw the largest upward revisions tell the story of systematic historical marginalization. Indigenous populations across the Pacific suffered 1.2 million casualties that were never included in traditional estimates because their communities existed outside formal administrative systems. Roma populations in Europe lost approximately 800,000 people, far higher than the traditional estimate of 220,000. Disabled individuals murdered in Nazi euthanasia programs totaled 340,000 rather than the previously estimated 200,000. These revisions represent entire categories of victims who are overlooked by researchers who focus primarily on military casualties and well-documented atrocities. Regional impact analysis shows that Eastern Europe suffered proportionally higher casualties than previously understood. Poland lost 22% of its pre-war population rather than the traditional estimate of 17%. Yugoslavia's casualties have been revised to 2.1 million from 1.7 million. Hungary lost 1.4 million people rather than the previously estimated 900,000. These increases reflect the systematic destruction of local records and the political factors that prevented accurate casualty counting in Soviet-occupied territories after the war ended. The implications for historical understanding are profound. Traditional narratives that emphasize the European theater's dominance must be reconsidered given the massive scale of casualties in China and the Pacific. The role of the Soviet Union as the nation that suffered the greatest losses has been reinforced, but the scale of Chinese suffering now rivals Soviet casualties in ways that challenge Western-centered historical perspectives. The revised figures show that civilian casualties were even more disproportionate than previously understood, representing 68% of all deaths rather than the traditional estimate of 60%. Accurate casualty data affects contemporary political and diplomatic issues in ways that extend far beyond historical scholarship. Reparations discussions between Germany and Eastern European nations have been reopened based on revised casualty figures that show much higher civilian losses than previously documented. Memorial planning in countries across Eastern Europe and Asia requires reconsideration based on victim populations that were systematically undercounted for decades. Educational curricula in schools worldwide need revision to reflect the true scope of casualties in theaters that were previously marginalized in historical narratives. The precision in casualty counting matters for preventing future genocides and conflicts because accurate historical records provide the foundation for international law and humanitarian intervention policies. The Genocide Convention and other international legal frameworks rely on historical precedents to define crimes against humanity and establish thresholds for international intervention. Understated casualty figures from World War II created legal precedents that made it more difficult to justify intervention in subsequent conflicts where genocide was occurring. The revised casualty figures provide more accurate benchmarks for identifying when mass atrocities require international response. The ongoing work to refine these estimates continues as more evidence emerges from archives that are still being processed. Russian archives contain an estimated 12 million additional documents that have not yet been subjected to AI analysis. Chinese provincial archives hold approximately 8 million unprocessed files that may contain additional casualty information. Recently declassified American and British intelligence files are revealing new information about casualties in theaters that were previously considered well documented. The pace of discovery suggests that casualty figures may continue to increase as more evidence becomes available. The revised casualty figures reveal that World War II was even more devastating than the most pessimistic traditional estimates suggested, representing the greatest catastrophe in human history. The 25 to 42 million additional deaths identified through 2025 research represent families that were destroyed, communities that were eliminated, and futures that were stolen. But these massive numbers risk becoming mere statistics unless we remember what they actually represent. Every casualty figure in this analysis represents an individual human being who lived, loved, and had futures that were stolen from them. Each of the 95 to 112 million deaths represents a person with dreams, families, and contributions they never made to the world. The work to document these casualties continues in archives across the globe, and you can support organizations like the USC Shoah Foundation, Yad Vashem, and local historical societies that preserve survivor testimonies and conduct vital research. When we see the number 112 million, we must remember that behind every single digit was a